Hey, World History, and welcome to U1-L2, How We Measure Historical Events. So your learning targets: understand how time is measured, distinguish between AD, BC, and CE, BCE, understand basic concept of a timeline, and how to do the three main questions to analyze historical documents. So your job, you will get used to this really, really fast because I do a lot of ed puzzles. But I'm going to walk you through what you need to do today. So, as you watch this ed puzzle, you're also going to have the U1-L1 study guide open. You're going to take notes as you watch this video. Any vocab word that is like an important concept will be in red text. Typically, the vocab words and important contents are in order of the video. That's also on the order of your study guide. You're going to write down your own definitions, or you can take my definitions. That is okay. There is no Googling or plagiarizing with the study guide, so you can't just go and let's say your vocab word was like Napoleon. You can't just go Google Napoleon and copy and paste whatever pops up. You need to use the information that I give you from the lessons and the unit. And if you do get Google or plagiarize, it will be a zero. And I'm not talking about just a zero for that one question. I'm talking about a zero for the entire study guide. So make sure you're not doing that. Also, information that is not said on the video that somehow pops up in your study guide, I'm going to suspect you probably a plagiarism. That will also lead to a zero, not just for that one question, but for the entire study guide. So make sure that you are taking the information directly off of the Edpuzzle video that I give you, and you can look in the resource folder to find these slideshows as well. Okay? So, questions I ask you that you only need to answer on the Edpuzzle. So, things that you do not need to write down on your study guide are going to pop up in blue text. Questions will pop up on the side of your Edpuzzle video. You're going to answer them the best you can. Now, a lot of the answers, you're not going to know what the actual answer is. I just want you to take your best educated guess. So I'm not grading on what is necessarily right or wrong, just as long as you gave me an educated guess. So if I have a question like, I don't know, who do you think the king is during the time period? And you tell me like something not very educated, like jelly beans or something like that, I'm going to give you a zero because that's not an educated guess. I will also deduct points from Edpuzzle grade if you give a very off-topic response. And again, I look at every single answer you guys give on Edpuzzle. Okay, so I look at everything you write. So again, if your Edpuzzle is not pausing and popping up anything throughout this video, when you see like those blue questions, make sure your ad blocker is turned off. So your job is also to remember that the study guides are due on the day of the test. So another thing too that I talked about back in your orientation folder is that maybe you saw that a grade came through on Schoology for your Edpuzzle and you got like a 0 or a 1.7 or a 3 or like a 4.44. Sometimes they're really odd numbers. And you're like, but I watched the Edpuzzle and I watched it all the way through. What's up? Again, don't panic. That is just Edpuzzle kicking a grade into Schoology. It just tells me that you completed it. That's where I have to go into Edpuzzle and grade it myself. Give me like 48 hours to grade the Edpuzzles. And if you did the Edpuzzle all correctly, you will get 5 points. Also, make sure that you are watching the Edpuzzle all the way to the end. You might get an icon like this, or you might get an icon like this. All right, so before we begin, do you have any questions about Edpuzzle? And if you don't, you can just type none. All right, let's get the slideshow started. So the first question I am going to ask you is, what is time? You're going to answer these in the Edpuzzle with an educated guess, so no Googling, okay? So who defines time? And how do you describe time? I know, they're very like deep thinking questions. So here's another good question. What is history? So history is a chronological record of significant events as affecting a nation or institution, usually of their causes. Okay. And then answering that question, what is time? Time is the measured or measurable period during which an action, process, or condition exists or continue. Right? So a lot of times you see timelines. That's a really big thing that we use in history. That's one of the tools that we use to measure time. So how do we measure time? So what we do in the modern day typically is seconds, hours, minutes. Those are the most common. But also days, weeks, months, years, decades, centuries, and millenniums. So here's another question for you. Is our calendar that we use on a daily basis, so the things like, we have the months of January, February, March, April, May, is that the only calendar to exist in the world? No. There are a lot of other kinds of calendars around the world and time. So, did you know actually today's year is 5,783? Yeah. That's if you went by the Hebrew calendar. So the Hebrew calendar begins when the Hebrews believe creation began, which would be an estimated to be about 3,760 BCE. Or did you know that the calendar is year is actually 1445? Yeah, that's right. That's if you went by the Islamic calendar. This calendar began with the year that Muhammad fled from Mecca. We'll learn more about that during Unit 6. So, how will we define time in this class? So, about 10 or so years ago, schools used to use something called AD and BC. What do you think AD means and what do you think BC means? Yes, that's right. So the calendars that we most commonly use in Western society, so the ones with like January, February, March, has its origins from the birth of Christ. So these are called the Gregorian calendar. So AD used to mean Anno Domini, which was the year of the Lord, and BC used to mean before Christ. So actually, the calendar that we use today wasn't invented until about 1582 when Christopher Clavius introduced our present calendar. It allowed for 365 days and one leap year every year that is divisible by 4. Okay, so here's the dude. This is Pope Gregory the 13th approving of that new calendar. So BCE and AD are old news. Today, historians use CE and BCE. So BCE is what would be kind of like the old BC. So BCE means before Common Era. And then CE, which is kind of like the old AD, means Common Era. So the switch from BC to BCE and AD to CE don't change any of the dates or the years or anything like that. It's just more of a way that historians use dating in a historical sense. So, for example, July 4th, 1776 CE would be the same thing as like July 4th, 1776 AD. Same thing with September 12th, 2023 CE. That would be the same as September 12th, 2023 AD. And July 13th, 100 BCE is the same as July 13th, 100 BC. Some websites are updated with the BCE and CE thing, and some still use BC and AD. So when you do research projects, um, some websites use more of the modern stuff. Some websites use more of the older stuff. So just don't get confused. I guess that's what I'm trying to tell you. So here's another question. What is a timeline? So a timeline is a chart that shows events in the flow of time, giving you a picture of how they relate to each other. Events are linked to the timeline by lines to the point precisely of where they occurred. And then typically they're divided into even divisions depending on the length of time shown. So here's kind of my example timeline I have. So if you had a bunch of events, what would happen is you would make kind of a line or a bar or something like that. You would split it up in accordance to like the years. You would typically put the years or the dates that that timeline occurred. And then typically you put the events of what happened during those times. So for an example here, this is like Hurricane Katrina timeline. Okay, so you can see the days that like the hurricane formed and then when it hit and then the aftermath. All right, now we're going to switch subjects just for a little bit. So documents. In this course, every unit, well, mostly every unit, we will analyze a primary source document. So here's a question. What is the difference between a primary source and a secondary source? A primary source is documented by someone who witnessed or experienced the event. A secondary source documented by someone who is interpreting the event. They did not see it for themselves. So, for example, let's take Pearl Harbor. I know you guys probably learned about that in US history. So, an example of a primary source would be this soldier right here. This soldier is looking at what is happening at Pearl Harbor. He is witnessing the event for himself. So if he wrote a letter to his mom being like, "Mom, you're never going to believe what happened," that would be a primary source because he witnessed the event. A secondary source would be like this kid who's listening to the radio. So that news broadcaster is telling this kid about Pearl Harbor. But the thing is, that newscaster was not there on the ground when Pearl Harbor happened. So that would be considered a secondary source because that newscaster did not experience the event himself. All right, so with primary and secondary sources, both of them could be written, they could be on TV, they could be spoken, videotaped, artists represented, diaries, letters, memoirs, journals, speeches, manuscripts, and interviews. There's a ton of different ways that you can get a source. So here is some examples. A primary source example would be like the Declaration of Independence, right? Because that was written by the founding fathers themselves. They were there for the beginning of the United States. A secondary source example would be the book called Martin Luther King Jr., a biography by Roger Bruns. Because Roger Bruns did not experience Martin Luther King Jr.'s life. He's just writing about Martin Luther King Jr. Here's another example. So a primary source would be something like, "I went to the Mall of America today and I saw Harry Styles on the Ferris wheel." That's a primary source because you yourself are witnessing Harry Styles on the Ferris wheel. A secondary source would be, "My friend went to the Mall of America today and saw Harry Styles on the Ferris wheel." That's a secondary source because you yourself were not there to see Harry Styles. You're getting this information secondhand from your friend. So let's do a little quiz. Which of these four sources are primary sources? All right, so we have the autobiography of Benjamin Franklin, the New York Post magazine about the Queen, the Civil War, a documentary film by Ken Burns, and an interview with Taylor Swift about her Eras tour. Yeah, this can get a little tricky. So A is definitely a thumbs up. That's the autobiography of Benjamin Franklin. He wrote about his own life. He experienced that firsthand. That is for sure a primary source. New York Post about the Queen. See, it wasn't written by the queen, so that would be a secondary source because the journalists who are writing about the queen did not experience her life themselves. They're just interpreting it. Now, this one is really tricky. You would think, a documentary? How is that not a primary source? Yeah, right? You would think that, but it's actually considered a secondary source. But there could be primary sources in it. So, for example, um, right? So most of like documentaries are usually narrated. That would be the secondary source. But let's say there's like a photograph or there's a video clip of someone during that event speaking. That could be considered a primary source in those instances. So typically, documentaries are a mix between the two. And then Taylor Swift being interviewed about her Eras tour, that would be a primary source because Taylor Swift is talking about her own musical tour. All right, now we're going to talk about some grammatical symbols in historical text. Now, this is probably not going to come up super much, but it is really nice to know what these weird symbols mean. So the first one is going to be SIC in brackets or sick. So if you ever see this on a primary source, it means that the translator of the text is letting the reader know there is a grammar mistake in the original language, and the translator is just leaving it as an error. So for an example, the two of us are going out to dinner tonight at Maynard's. You would see that two, right, is the wrong kind of two. It should be TWO. But maybe this was translated and the translator wanted to keep it with the spelling mistake. So they would put the SIC mark to indicate that they left it as the original language. Then you have footnotes. You'll see these quite a bit. So a footnote is when the author slash translator wants to make a note about the subject being written. And the note is usually then included at the bottom of the page. For example, it might say in the main part of the text, he is the powerful god of all of Greece, and all other gods are below him. And you're like, who is he? Who is this dude that the author's talking about? So you follow the footnote. So, for example, this would be number one. You follow to the number one at the bottom of the page, and it'll say, like, Zeus, the Greek god of the sky, the ruler of gods and humans. You might also see the three dots or the three dots in bracket. And this means that the original text is broken or missing, but historians don't know what words are missing. This happens a lot in ancient history because a lot of the times things were written on clay or stone and they get fragmented. So for an example, it might say, Yarim has ordered 3 jugs of, and then it might be broken. So there's ... Payment in copper ... Received tomorrow. You might also just see brackets. So brackets mean that part of the original text is missing or deformed, like you could see down here in this picture where there's a big chip. But historians can actually figure out what word should be in the text. So for example, if we were reading like this cuneiform tablet, it might say something like, to the sleeping one who lay at rest, to him who would not arise from his sleep. So with the brackets right here, that piece is broken off. It's missing. But the historians can figure out what words should be in there. All right, now we're going to talk about how to analyze a historical document. Now, there are many ways to analyze a historical document, and when doing so, I encourage you to underline and take side notes on concepts you think are important or you might be confused about. In this class, there are 3 main questions you should ask about a document, and I'm going to go through them today. So the 3 main questions to analyze a document. First question, who were the authors of the primary sources? 2, who is the audience of these primary sources, and who were these primary sources written for? Now, this one's tricky because a lot of the times students say something like, oh, this primary source document was written for students or historians or someone who's interested in history. But no, that's not it. You have to be even more specific than that. You need to think deeper about the time period. I'll go through an example. And the third question is, why were these primary sources written? What messages are the authors trying to get across? So let's take a look at an example right here. All right. Let's do, fit. There we go. So I'm going to read out this example first, and then I'm going to go back and tell you what I was doing. So it says 3 main questions to analyze historical document example. So introduction. The Diary of a Young Girl, journal by Anne Frank, a Jewish teenager who chronicled her family's 2 years in hiding during the German occupation of the Netherlands during World War II. The book was first published in 1947, 2 years after Anne's death in a concentration camp, and later became a classic of war literature. In 1940, the Netherlands was invaded by Germany. In July of 1942, Margot, Anne's sister, received an order to report to a labor camp. Facing arrest if she did not comply, the family went into hiding on July 6, 1942, moving into a secret annex at Otto's business in Amsterdam, the entrance to which was soon hidden behind a movable bookcase. The Franks were later joined by 4 other Jews, Hermann and Auguste von Pels and their son Peter, and Fritz Pfeiffer, and were aided by several friends, including Mayip Gais, who brought food and other supplies. All right, so typically when I give you a primary source, I'm going to have some sort of introduction. What an introduction is just pretty much a way for me to show you how what's going on in that time period. It gives you kind of background information. So that's what that is here. Now you might see this name down here. Oops, sorry about that. This name right here. You're like, who is that person? That is the person who wrote the introduction. And I'm just giving that introduction to you, and I'm giving that author credit for it. Okay? And then typically after that, that is where I actually have the primary source itself. So here's the diary entry from August 21st, 1942. Now our secret annex has truly become secret, because so many houses are being searched for hidden bicycles. Mario Kugler thought it would be better to have a bookcase built in front of the entrance to our hiding place. It swings out on its hinges and opens like a door. Mr. Voskugel did the carpentry work. Mr. Voskugel has been told that the 7 of us are in hiding, and he's been most helpful. Now, whenever we want to go up downstairs, we have to duck and then jump. After the first 3 days, we were all walking around with bumps on our foreheads and banging our heads against the low doorway. Then Peter cushioned it by nailing a towel stuffed with wood shavings to the door frame. Let's see if it helps. All right. So now let's answer the 3 main questions on analyzing a historical document. First question, who is the author of the primary source? All right. Typically, I give you a hint to look at the directions or introduction page. So this one's pretty easy. In the introduction, it says The Diary of a Young Girl, journal by Anne Frank. So bam, we already have that first answer. Anne Frank, a girl in hiding during World War II. All right, second question. Who is the audience of these primary sources? Who were these primary sources written for? And again, don't say, oh, historians or students or everyone. Think deeper about this time period, about what message the author wanted to give the people. Okay? So, for this one, I'm going to say this diary entry was meant for Anne's eyes only, because diaries were kept typically private. And then 3, why were these primary sources written? What messages are the authors trying to get across? So in this one, I would say something like, Anne is documenting her everyday life and the everyday struggles with hiding from the Nazis in World War II. Okay? There you go. Awesome. So that's the example of the three main questions to analyze a historic document. All right, let's move on back to the slideshow. All right, so today we learned about history, time, BC, BCE, AD, CE, timeline, primary source, secondary source, SIC, footnotes, the dots or the dots in brackets, the brackets, and the three main questions to analyze historical documents. Next up, you're going to do U1-L3, History of Early Humans and Puzzles. Make sure that you're following along with the Lesson 3 section in your study guide. Of course, if you have questions, please email me. And if you want to learn more, you can certainly email me too. And then also, hopefully, I'll post the weekly check-in as well, which is optional, but always fun to do. All right, thanks for listening. Bye.